Welcome to the Computational Medicine Podcast, where we discuss AI and computational technologies being deployed in medicine. I'm Alex, a doctor working in London. Today we're talking to Dr. James Zou, who is an assistant professor of biomedical data science and computer science at Stanford University. He works on making machine learning more reliable, human compatible, and statistically rigorous. He received his Ph.D. from Harvard in 2014 and was a one-time member of Microsoft Research, a Gates Scholar at Cambridge, and a Simmons Fellow at UC Berkeley. He joined Stanford in 2016, and his research is supported by the Sloan Fellowship and Google and Tencent AI awards. He recently published a very high-quality paper looking at using EchoNet, an AI model to help interpret echocardiogram scans. It was published in Nature Medicine and showed that AI saved clinician time and had as good scan interpretation as echocardiogram sonographers. One of the key factors that made this paper so effective was the fact that it was randomized, blinded, and prospective. Factors that are often not present in medical papers, but are crucial to make the evidence of what they show robust. We discussed his work on EchoNet and similar projects, what factors he considers are important to making effective medical AI papers, and where he sees these models being deployed in the future. Okay, so thank you very much, Dr. Zou, for agreeing to chat to us today. So can we just kick off by you telling us a bit about your background and how you came to work on the projects that you do currently?
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me, Alex. Excited to be here. So I'm a professor at Stanford, where I lead a group developing AI algorithms for biomedical applications. So I came to Stanford in 2016. Before Stanford, so my background was in applied math and computer science. I was been doing my PhD on developing machine learning and mathematical models. I initially started out by looking at more biological data, like genomics kinds of data. And since I came to Stanford, we still do a lot of work on the more biological discovery side, but we've also been expanding our interest on the translational aspect, right? So how do we really take these algorithms and the insights we're developing from the earlier stage discoveries and really translating that into improving patient outcomes? Right? So a lot of our focus over the last few years in my group was really terrific students is doing that translation component.
Lovely, and that leads very well into the one of the papers that I read recently of yours. So the cardiology paper where you applied a model to echocardiography and found that it was as effective as sonographers in detecting various cardiac issues. So could you just tell us a bit about that paper?
Yeah. So we're super excited about that work. And I guess the background is that these cardiac ultrasound videos, right? It's one of the most routine ways that people use to assess how well your heart is functioning, right? So there's tens of millions of these done every year in the U.S. and I think also many millions done every year in the U.K., right? So it's really a very routine measure. And the current way that people actually doctors, clinicians assess these videos is quite manual, right? So they have to sort of look at these videos of people's heartbeats and sort of trace out the individual frames, right, where the heart is expanded, where the left ventricle chamber is expanded, or when the chamber is contracted. So they trace out those frames by hand, and then they sort of compute based on those tracings, like what is the contraction or ejection fraction, right? So if the ejection fraction is very low, then an indication that maybe the heart is not functioning properly. So even though there's tens of millions of these videos analyzed every year, the process of analyzing these videos in a standard clinical workflow is really based on these manual evaluations. This is where we thought that maybe AI, especially computer vision, could be very helpful. Right? So basically, around 5 years ago, we started the initial project of developing this AI algorithm called EchoNet for assessing these ejection fractions from these cardiac ultrasound videos, also called echocardiograms. So the initial paper was actually published in 2020. So it was in Nature, where we did this more standard retrospective analysis. By retrospective, I just mean that we developed the AI algorithm, and then we had some other separate previously collected data sets, and then we applied the algorithm on those data sets to see how well did it work, right, compared to the ground truth. And the algorithm worked quite well. But for the last 3 years, there's always this nagging question, right, for us that's like, okay, so the algorithm works sort of, on a sort of a synthetic evaluation. Basically, it's on real data, but it's on retrospective data. Right? So we don't really know how well it works when the clinicians are actually using it in real time. Right? So that's sort of the big question was these medical AI. So that motivated us for the last 3 years to really set up this randomized and then prospective study, right, where we're where the algorithms are integrated into the standard clinical workflow for cardiologists and for sonographers, and then we can really assess, like, in a real time fashion, like how much does the algorithm really benefit cardiologists and benefit sonographers in their regular workflows, right? So that was sort of the context and motivation for this study.
Fantastic. And just to clarify the ground truth and the data acquisition in there, was it that you mentioned sort of drawing out the cardiac chambers? Was that done by a person, or was it self-supervised learning?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the ground truth there come from human clinicians who are drawing these chambers, right? So there are basically sort of two steps in that getting that ground truth. The first step is that there's a sonographer, right, who takes these videos, and then she might be doing like these sort of segmentations or doing the tracings, and then in the standard clinical workflow, right? So then there's like a cardiologist who come on, right, later on, and the cardiologist, like, she might look at these videos and say, okay, maybe I would agree with the sonographer, in which case then she would just keep the original tracings from sonographer, or she might say, okay, maybe I want to modify this tracing a little bit, right? So then she has this opportunity to then modify the tracings. So then we actually use the cardiologist's final readouts, right, of the ejection fraction as basically the ground truth to both evaluate how good is the sonographer and also how good is the AI algorithm.
Brilliant. And what types of machine learning models did you use for that paper, and why did you go for those models?
Yeah, so because the input data here we're working with is kind of a video, right? So we worked with a particular kinds of video-based neural network or deep learning models, right? So it's basically called a spatial temporal convolutional neural network, right? Which is basically a fancy way of saying that, okay, so the neural network is going to scan across the individual frame, right, to look for spatial patterns, right, in the heart chamber, but it's also going to scan across the temporal dimension, this time axis, to see if there are some temporal changes, right? For example, in the beating of the chamber, that's informative as to the tracings and also to the ejection fraction estimate. Right. So this is sort of a neural network algorithm that we developed for analyzing its ejection fraction from ultrasound videos.
Brilliant. And just zooming out into the big picture with this, so I've read that less than 1% of academic machine learning papers actually make it from being a paper in theory to being deployed in use with real patients. So what do you think needs to be done to improve that number, to improve the percentage?
Yeah, so I think there is really a huge barrier from medical AI research into medical AI deployment and adoption, right? So I think first factor of this barrier is actually something that you mentioned, that like a lot of the academic research is based on these more retrospective analysis, right? So there's actually very few prospective studies testing medical AI algorithms, right? So for example, like the EchoNet algorithm described, so we actually purposely set it up so that's a real-time prospective study, so people are actually using it. And then it's also a blinded study, so we set up like a clinical trial, right? So then we can get really a head-to-head comparison of how much do physicians really benefit from using the algorithm. Most of the academic research has been set up more as like this kind of evaluations on benchmark data sets. Right? So what that means is that actually we don't really know how well those algorithms would benefit clinicians when the clinicians using those algorithms. And for most of the medical AI, right, they're not meant to be making their own decisions, but more meant to be as assistants to the clinicians. And the fact that we don't know how well the clinicians would interact with these algorithms, I think makes it harder to really deploy them in real time in actual usage. So that's one of the big barriers. I think the other big barrier is more on the regulatory and on the financial side, right? It's basically comes down to like the economics of how do these medical AI algorithms will get reimbursed, right? And how do they get basically compensated to be deployed in their usage? Just to give you a concrete example, in the US, there are actually over 500 medical AI algorithms that are approved by the FDA, right, to be used on patients. They're actually already have received FDA approval, which is great. But when we actually look at among those 500, like how many of them are actually deployed or adopted in hospitals, there's only a handful of like less than 10 that have seen any substantial usage patterns by real patients. Right. So that's like another gap is even after you get FDA approval, there's still just this gap because of the economics, right? In how to get these algorithms get reimbursed and get adopted in practice.
And just telling us a little bit more about the so what do you think it was about those 10 algorithms that were setting them apart from the other technologies that were being deployed? So in terms of the reimbursement, was it that they would have to be relatively easy to get reimbursed? The case for them having improved the patient's outcome would have had to be pretty clear cut. Because, at least off the top of my head, I think the majority of AI that we're seeing deployed in medicine right now is mostly around imaging. So stuff that patients actually get access, stuff that actually improves like a patient's admission. A big chunk of it is imaging, and then alongside that, we've got a lot of say structural things
Yeah.
in terms of healthcare system management. But were the majority of those ones that you saw that were very useful, impactful imaging, or were there other ones in there as well?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So the ones that we are seeing, the handful that are getting high adoption, I think are almost all of them are imaging-based AI models, right? So for example, they'll look at like there's an algorithm for diabetic retinopathy, right? So that's basically a computer vision algorithm. And I think one reason that there's a couple of factors that leads to the higher adoption, right? So first is that these algorithms, they would actually, on the financial side, it actually have a well-defined reimbursement code. So that means that every time the algorithm is being used in the hospital context, right? So then there's a clear way for the insurance companies to pay for those algorithms being used. Right? And the second is that these algorithms are often looking at the relatively well defined, and in many cases, like relatively, these are not high risk applications, right? So that also makes it easier for it to be integrated into the clinical workflow.
And what do you think is the next imaging in medicine, in AI medicine? So what do you think is going to be the next kind of general sphere that AI is going to be deploying in medicine, but that is outside, say, medical imaging?
Yeah. Yeah. So at first, I still think that there's a lot of room for further expand on medical imaging side, right? So a lot of the existing algorithms are more focused on these radiology applications. And for example, we actually are in the process of getting working on the FDA submissions for this cardiology applications that we have, right, for the EchoNet algorithm, and we're excited to expand that out across many different hospitals in the U.S. but also internationally. Right. And outside of imaging, I think the other place where AI can be has already getting a lot of attention can be very useful is on the more like natural language processing side, right? So especially with the recent advances in these large language models, right? So there's a lot of interesting applications of using these large language models and related technologies, right, to help with different stages of the clinical workflow. Just to give you like a concrete example, was a bunch of fantastic collaborators. We actually have been using these large language models to help to more for like education outreach, right? To basically simplify more complicated medical information for patients, right? One example of this is that if you look at a lot of the medical consent forms, they all can also be very complicated. If you go into a surgery, then you get these pages of consent with a lot of jargons, and it's hard to figure out what's going on, even for doctors, but especially for patients, right? So we actually found that it's quite useful to just take these large language models and then essentially rewrite these consent forms and translate it into a much simpler language, right? Sort of at sixth grade or eighth grade reading levels, so that the patients, they can really understand what they're getting themselves into, right, in these operations. But the simpler versions of consent forms will kind of still contain all of the key information that was in this original, more complicated version. So that's like sort of an example of beyond diagnosis and treatment, or how we can actually use AI to improve the transparency of the entire healthcare system.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think a lot of it's nice to hear of one concrete example where it's making it's making a clear cut impact. I think a lot of fears that I hear around NLPs in medicine is is more the on the hallucinatory side. So the fact that it can they're sort of generative. So on specifically on the consent side of things, how did you sort of counterbalance for the for the sort of creative generative side of things where it can come up with at least with ChatGPT and other models that's been that's been one big fear. So how did you guys counterbalance for that?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting question because um, the risks of using these generative models, especially large language models, very much depends on how we use them, right? So in our experience, like if you just sort of ask it to create sort of entirely open-ended questions, then it's true that the models can hallucinate, right? Especially in settings where it has not seen a lot of training data, or if the question is sort of unfamiliar, it can come up with all sorts of creative or just wrong answers. But another way of using it is to not just ask it open-ended questions, but ask it to essentially be like a copy editor, right? So, or to retrieve information, or to basically rewrite information, right? What's the medical consent form, right? So there, it's actually we give it, so essentially like the input is just the original consent form, so it has all of the information it needs, right? So the only thing that it is asked to do is basically rewrite it, simplify that information into a form that's easier for humans to understand, right? So that's lower risk because like then it's much more constrained space where the language model and generative AI is operating over. And moreover, what we did was that we then took the output from the AI model, right, from GPT-4, the simplified consent forms, and then we had doctors and also lawyers to review that consent form to ensure that it actually contains all of the key information that was in the original consent form, right? So then this provides like an additional layer of checks and balances to ensure that the information is accurate.
Brilliant, fantastic. And what are so other than papers not being prospective and double and blinding, are there any other common pitfalls you see when we try to deploy AI in medicine?
Yeah, so I think uh, being more transparent about the data that was used to train and also to develop and evaluate these AI models is often one of the big challenges. So we've done a lot of research and a lot of work on what we're calling sort of data-centric problems in machine learning, especially in healthcare. And oftentimes, what we find is that when an algorithm does not work as well as intended, especially in healthcare medical context, most of the time, the root causes of that can actually be traced back to some biases or limitations in the data that was used to develop that model, or the data that was used to do the initial evaluations of that model. Right. So a lot of the work that on the research side we've been doing in my group is to figure out like, how do we make this whole data process more accountable, right? So like if the algorithm exhibits certain biases in deployment, can we actually then figure out which specific training data or sources of training data is actually responsible for that bias, right? For the mistakes that models make, right? Then by doing that, then we can come back and then maybe improve the training data, improve the model, and make the whole system more transparent. So I think data is really the biggest challenge.
That leads very nicely into my next question, which is about medical data sets. So, what do you think are the best efforts you've seen to improve the quality and availability of medical data sets?
Yeah, so I think in the past it's actually been very challenging to share medical data sets, right? Especially because of privacy and other considerations. And actually, it's some of the more recent data regulations legislations also have made it um, quite stringent, right, to be able to share these kinds of data. But at the same time, I think we're also getting better at uh, anonymizing data sets, right? Especially medical imaging data sets. For example, a lot of the data that we used for train our EchoNet or the cardiology AI algorithms, so those are based on these ultrasound videos, and we're able to basically systematically de-identify those videos. And after doing that, we actually released all of that data, right? So it's called EchoNet dataset, right? So anyone, you or any of the listeners can just go on and search for EchoNet, and you can actually find over 10,000 of these videos that we have released that people can just use for their own development, for their own assessments. Right. So I'm very much supportive of this push to sort of open source uh, a lot more of the medical data sets, especially both on the imaging side and other kinds of modalities like biomarkers and genomics. Um, because I think that's these kind of more open source and publicly accessible data sets is really critical for more developments of medical AI algorithms. And I think like these other big efforts like the UK Biobank, right, in the UK and similar initiatives in other countries, it's also a great step towards open sourcing a lot more of these important medical data sets.
And how does your team manage the collaboration between those with a medical expertise and those with a computational expertise when working on a project? How do you make sure that the collaboration is effective?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and it's often one of the sort of really important design decisions, right, for these medical AI research projects. So we're very well aware that our core strength, at least for my group, and given my background, is that we're coming from the more computer science AI side. Right, so most of the students in my group are computer scientists or engineers or statisticians, right? So they're coming from those backgrounds. So to complement that, right? So I've also tried to essentially recruit MD PhDs to come and join the group, right? So oftentimes they'll come to the group as postdocs. So they'll spend some time every week, maybe they'll spend a day a week, in their clinics and seeing patients, and then the other 4 days every week, then they'll be working closely with my computational students, right, on these projects. And I've actually found it to be very extremely helpful to have these really terrific MDs or MD PhDs, basically as core members in the group, because then they have a lot of expertise, especially on the patient-facing side, right? So and then they also know like what are the really important clinical questions and how to responsibly, get curated the right data sets for developing the machine learning models.
And can you talk us through the process that you go through when deciding what sort of projects to work on? I remember hearing, I think it was one of Andrew Nung's students mentioning that they always think it in terms of HCM, HMU, hundreds of millions of users. Do you guys go for a sort of similar kind of methodology in terms of the medical side of things, like looking for implementations you can make that can scale up? I can imagine that was an element in your thinking with the EchoNet. But are there any other considerations when you're deciding what sort of projects to work on?
Yeah, it's that's always an interesting question. So I think there's a few axes of factors that we want to consider. Scale is one, but it's not really the only, certainly not the only or the main consideration, right? So I think for us, one of the big factors is first, is this actually the right clinical problem to solve, right? And a part of that is that if we solve that problem, is there a clear route that for actually deploying and translating the AI algorithms in clinical settings? Right? Because there are certainly a lot of other problems where it's maybe interesting from the research perspective, but for a variety of reasons, because maybe data access or because we don't have or because it's sort of maybe a less common disease, where it's just not clear actually how we can deploy this algorithm in practice, right, in healthcare. Right. So we tend to prioritize algorithms where it's sort of in the sweet spot, right, where the problem is really really important, right? And there's clearly a clinical need, right, for that algorithm, right? And then there's also a clear pathway that if we actually come up with a technology, then there's a way to get it through the process and to actually be deployed. Right. And once we identify the right problems, then we think about like who are the best partners to bring in, right? So these could be some of my internal clinical postdocs, or we also can look for external partners at companies, at pharma companies, or at hospitals, right? And then we try to build the right data sets and the right teams to work on those problems.
And what are some of the most exciting AI deployments in medicine that improve structural efficiency that you've seen?
I think the one relatively low hanging fruits of AI on the more like efficiency side is on try to analyze and extract information from clinical notes and from claims, right? Because also a lot of those processing, so for example, of insurance claims or of clinical notes, is quite time consuming. And in the past, it also relies on quite a lot of manual labor to assess those information. And there's like billions and many millions and billions of these uh, produced every year, right? So I think that's like a pretty good application of a lot of the language models and natural language processing, right? Just because oftentimes, right, for a large number of these nodes and claims, they're quite standardized, right? So they're often looking at sort of similar output or similar diagnosis codes to try to extract, right, from or billing codes to try to extract from these claims. So maybe it's sort of like an 80-20 settings where 80% of these codes can actually be pretty well processed efficiently by AI algorithms, right? And then you can focus the human energy on these harder 20% of the cases. Right. So, for example, a lot of the previous work we've been doing in the group is actually working with insurance companies on deploying these deploying these language models to partially automate the processing of these claims.
So on the regulation side of things, how do you think? Could you just give us an overview of how you think these technologies are going to be regulated and how best they could be regulated?
Yeah. So I think the regulatory landscape is also actively changing right now, right? So previously, a lot of these, and for example, like the FDA is also actively thinking about how to what's the best way to actually regulate these medical AI algorithms. Right? I think so. Previously, a lot of these algorithms are regulated similar to how people regulate software, right? Like you have to go through approval, and then to demonstrate the initial, to get like the initial FDA approval, you have to basically demonstrate the performance of the model. You have to reach certain levels of accuracy, right, or efficacy. But the interesting and maybe somewhat unique challenge about AI is that the models can also change over time, right? It's like the nature of machine learning is that the more data that it sees, right? So the model can actually adapt and learn from the data and potentially improve its performance, right, or adapt its performance to new users. Right. So in the previous paradigm, this is actually not very compatible with regulation, right? Because every time you adapt or update the AI model, right, it actually, in principle, it has to go through the approval process again, right? It's considered sort of a new algorithm if it's updated. Then you have to go through this quite laborious process, which could take over a year, right, to run a new trial and run a new study and then get another approval for your updated algorithm, which is actually a strong incentive for AI developers and for companies to not update their AI models, just because if you do an update, you have to go through this approval process, which is expensive and time consuming, and that actually can be a bottleneck towards progress and advance, right, in medical AI. So one of the new interesting changes, right, that the regulators are considering right now is to make it much easier and more flexible for AI developers to continuously update their models, right? So the idea is that when a company goes through the initial approval submission process, right, they have an algorithm, but they can also attach the algorithm basically like a plan or strategy to how to monitor and to update the model over time, right? So maybe the company says that, okay, so here's like if it gets additional data, it might be updating the models on those new patients' data, right? And the regulators would try to approve both the algorithm and also the plan for updating the model, right? And if the updating plan is approved, then that becomes a more continuous pathway for the algorithms, right, to evolve over time. We still need to do careful monitoring of the algorithm to ensure that it doesn't, still safe over time. But I think that can potentially be an interesting way to make medical AI much more flexible from a regulatory perspective.
And the idea being that you wouldn't need to reapply for regulatory approval each time. It would be more sort of the initial approval and then more tracking of it.
That's right. It would be a much
Approved.
more lightweight process. Yes.
Okay. And do you think there are any areas of AI medicine that are currently overhyped? And do you think there are any areas that are underhyped?
I think one area that's I think is really important and it should get more attention is actually on clinical trials, right? Because clinical trials is really the bottleneck of the entire healthcare medical process, right? If you think about early stage discovery, translating that to patient, really clinical trials is the gatekeeper for all of that, right? So anything that we can do with using AI to improve clinical trials, I think is going to be hugely impactful for the entire translation medicine process, right? And it's also clinical trials currently are extremely expensive, right? So on the cost of bringing a drug to patients, on average, several billions of US dollars. And the trials can also be extremely difficult to design to run. Right. So I think there's a lot of potential in using AI to help us to first to design clinical trials, right, to make the trials much easier to run and also more inclusive, right? So you can recruit more representative, diverse patients, and also more efficient, right? And then the second is also to use the AI to sort of figure out like, what are the most appropriate and type of patients to basically to enroll in the trial, right? Or we're even using something like synthetic controls or using real world data to complement some of the clinical trials, right? So in other words, you don't have to actually run, instead of running a very large randomized clinical trial, which can be very time consuming, expensive, maybe you can run a smaller trial, but then using some of the data from the electronic health records to complement the findings from the trial, right? So I think these are a lot of interesting strategies for using AI to actually make the clinical trial process more efficient.
Are there any areas that you think are overhyped currently?
Yeah, so I think, for example, there's a lot of interest on like using large language models to solve different medical board exams, right? To solve or to basically pass all sorts of tests, right? From medical license exams to law school exams or into business school tests, right? So those are, I think, getting a lot of attention. I think they are, quite interesting and give us some insights into the capabilities of these large language models like ChatGPT. But I think those are not really the kinds of settings where we'll actually be using the large language models or using generative AI in medicine, right? So there, I would think is more of a curiosity rather than like real applications.
Just going back to the clinical trials information. Are there any examples of good companies or good projects that have improved the efficiency of clinical trials? I think I've seen a good number around, say, patient recruitment. But are there any other good examples that you can think of off the top of your head?
Yeah. So if I might actually plug one of our own research examples, we, together with our colleagues at Genentech, we actually developed this tool computation platform called Trial Pathfinder. Right. What a Trial Pathfinder does is that it actually helps uh, clinicians to design clinical trials. In particular, it helps to design the eligibility criteria to decide what patients to enroll in the clinical trial. As you might know, like the clinical trials often are very restrictive, right? So they have a lot of rules, like pages of rules to decide what patients are eligible and which patients are not eligible, right? And those can be very consequential on the outcomes of the trials, right? So this, what Trial Pathfinder, this AI system does is that it basically uses large scale medical records from hundreds of hospitals, and then to come up with data driven designs about okay, what patients should we try to enroll in this trial, and how do we design the trial to be both to be safe for the patients, but also to enroll like diverse patients, right? So we applied that to a bunch of different cancer trials and demonstrated that with using this platform Trial Pathfinder, we can more than double the number of eligible patients, which is great, while protecting the safety of patients. And also importantly, this actually enables us to enroll a lot more diverse patients, so a lot more women and more older patients and more minorities into clinical trials. So many of these groups previously were often excluded from participating in cancer trials because maybe they don't fall within some narrow range of lab values or they have other comorbidities. And what the AI algorithm learned is that we can actually enroll a lot of these patients while still maintaining the safety and efficacy of the trials.
Are there any books that you found particularly useful along the way?
Yeah, there's a couple of books that I've actually really quite enjoyed reading. So first, there's this book called Immunology, right? I think it's by Philip Detmer. It's so immunology can be like this. It's a very hairy subject, right? But this is actually one of my favorite science books because it really sort of explains what immunology, the intuitions behind different immunology, different immune cells, right? Your different T cells, neutrophils, B cells, and explains in a way that even computer scientists and engineers can really understand very well. So it's like extremely well written and very vivid, but accurate descriptions of immunology. Right. So as a computer scientist, I actually found it extremely interesting to learn really about the inner workings of the immune system by reading that book. Let's see. Another book that I enjoyed reading quite a lot recently. It's a book called "The $1 Billion Molecule." Right. I think it's by Barry Worth. right? So it's basically the story recently of like how a particular cancer treatment, like a targeted therapy for cancer, basically the pathway through which it was actually went from early stage research and development all the way into actually a drug, right? And all the different trials and tribulations that have been through to get it from research to actually into patients, where now it's actually being used and it's a very effective treatment for certain types of cancers. Right, so it's actually a really interesting and insightful and entertaining look into sort of the underworkings of the biotech industry. These are sort of two books that I read recently that I really enjoyed a lot.
Great. And have there been any? Do you think there have been any approaches that you've had towards your projects that you found particularly useful?
I think maybe the best advice I have is to um, try to spend a lot, definitely pay attention to finding the right questions, right? Like figure out like what are maybe the most clinically and scientifically interesting and meaningful questions, right? Before we diving into the specific projects, and once you find the right questions, then try to build the best team around solving that problem, right? Which could be some combination of internal expertise, right, and also external collaborators, or figure out who are the best collaborators and partners to bring together to the team to solve that problem.
Great advice. And outside of that, any other advice for students?
Yeah, so I would just say that this is a extremely exciting time and space, right? To be thinking about and to be working in this combination, this intersection of healthcare and medicine and AI, right? So these are different fields, but they're both seeing tremendous progress and advances. And I think this intersection that many of you and many of the folks here are interested in it's going to be really transformative for our society over the next several years and decades. Right? So this is definitely a great space to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely would agree with that. And what are so last question, what are your thoughts on AI safety outside of medicine?
Yeah, so I think we do want to be thoughtful, right, of trying to balance making sure that the algorithms that we develop are fair, they're have try to mitigate some of the biases in these models, right, which oftentimes also stem from biases in data sets that was used to train these models, right? At the same time, we also want to I think there are also a lot of exciting applications of these models, or potential applications of using AI to improve medicine and to make healthcare more affordable and more equitable, right? So I think we want to take like a balanced and thoughtful approach around improving the reliability and trustworthiness of the AI systems, and at the same time thinking about like, what are the places where it can have the most impact when being deployed.
Okay, great. That's it. That's my last question. Thank you very much, Dr. Zou. It's been so great chatting. You're clearly working at the absolute cutting edge of deploying machine learning in medicine, and it's great to see the papers that you guys are putting out. It's really it's really great to hear all of these things that just everyone in this space are saying that we need to prioritize, such as blinding, prospective, looking at areas that we need to we have a high need of improvement in early. So yeah, it's really great to have been able to chat and to hear about the amazing work you guys are doing. Thanks very much for taking the time.
Great. Well, yeah, it's really a pleasure to talk with you, Alex, and really enjoyed our discussions. And thanks for having me.
A massive thanks to Dr. Zou for taking his time. You can find links to all of his work in the description. Thanks very much for listening, and catch you next time.